We're having a guest speaker tonight, obviously. Brett Stark is here, and he is the co-founder and head of an organization called Terra Firma, which he will obviously talk about. It has to do with working with both legal and medical support for immigrant children and families who come to the States and need that kind of support. And I was struck by two particular threads. He'll tell you about what he does. I don't need to do that. But the two threads that really struck me were one, how important early, teenage and early programs sponsored by, in his case, from his synagogue and Jewish communities, to bring teenagers and young people into other parts of their communities, into the different classes, different races, different backgrounds, different nationalities, and how important it is for us when we're thinking about how to work on issues to remember that those formative experiences are exactly that, very, very formative, and are maybe some of the most important things that we as a supportive organization do. The other thread that really struck me in his work is how much it's not one person or one organization taking on a huge thing, although it is a huge thing and they are taking it on, but that to make it work, it's obvious that it is threaded into several different kinds of organizations, several different strengths, and that part of what is making Terra Firma's work and Brett's work so important and so effective is good networking, connections with other groups that have other strengths, and threading them together. So for all of us, when we choose whatever it is we do with our time, energy, money, focus, that those two things to me are priorities. How we foster connections for the youth and for our congregation as a whole, and break down barriers in safe ways that allow people to expand out. And that we, like everybody else, will find our strengths in networks with other people and other organizations. And I think Brett's work is a really fine example of what can come of both those threads. So please welcome Brett Stark.
And before Brett speaks, I just want to say Brett's going to speak and share his PowerPoint, and then we'll follow with Q&A. So please, if you think of a question, you want to jot it down and keep it for the end of his presentation, that would be appreciated. And I also would recommend everybody mute themselves just to down on background noise. And
okay. Thank you, everybody. My name is Brett. I'm really glad to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So thank you, Kathy, for introducing me, and thank you, Amy, for inviting me. It's really my honor to be here. I feel really lucky to be able to come and speak to a congregation just like the kind that I grew up in. And that really helped shape me as a person, and in particular, my beliefs and what I've chosen to do. And so what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the work that I do, kind of from a personal, then a big picture perspective, and then a narrower lens, or a zooming in. I hope it's useful to you all. I know there's probably a lot of knowledge in the room already. And I'm looking forward to just sharing my own experience, and then hearing from you all about what your experiences are, what your questions are, what speaks to you. So let me get started. And I think this is roughly kind of how I hope to present the meeting, talk a little bit about where I come from, then look at the global situation, and then drill down from there. So I don't have this slide in every presentation, but I think for this audience, I added it. And just as Kathy said, there really was a formative period of my life that began at Jewish day school or Jewish preschool, where concepts of being refugees ourselves, or being strangers in a strange land, as we say on Pesach, or, remembering that we ourselves came out of Egypt, I think really had a big imprint on my mind. And those kind of ideas came up in high school when I joined a program that was designed to create dialogue between the Black and Jewish communities in the DC area where I grew up. And I learned a lot about other perspectives and how other people see the world. That was really formative. And then I did a Jewish service trip, going to Honduras to do some development work, and then going to Ukraine and working with the Jewish community in Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine, I'm going to mention a little further on in the presentation. But I just wanted to add this slide to let you all know that the kind of communities that you are creating are instrumental to people like myself who have chosen to do this type of work. So I wanted to start with a cute slide. I called it From Immigration to Instagram, or From Immigrant to Instagram. And I worked for a refugee program, and we took a trip to Ellis Island. I'm based in New York City. And on that trip, I took what I thought was a pretty cool picture of the Statue of Liberty and walked around Ellis Island, which I'd never been there before. And what I learned is that at Ellis Island, they have a computer program where you can look up people whose names you know and see their immigration records. And so I was surprised to find my great-grandfather on my mother's side, his arrival records in the Ellis Island database. Looks like, according to this, he came in 1904 on October 26, and interestingly, 17 years old. And my work is with unaccompanied children, which I'm going to talk about later. And it's interesting to think about how my own great-grandfather came as an unaccompanied child, perhaps too, according to these records. And this was really fascinating for me to see my own immigrant past so out there like this. And then another thing I came across a short time later was a citizenship record of another great-grandfather. And it looks like in 1942, I know it might be hard to read, so I'll just try to describe it. Sorry, not 1942, where's the year here? Well, I can't find it. Oh yeah, 1928. Sorry, there it is. 1928, my grandfather's brother, according to this, became a US citizen. And I point this out not just as a family artifact, but because according to this certificate, the way that citizenship worked at the time is that my grandfather's father just had to swear that his son was his son. That's all it took. There was no big bureaucracy. There was no multi-year wait. There was no citizenship test, in the way that we think of it today. It was just kind of a gentleman's agreement, or take your word for it, that this person is the son of someone else who became a US citizen. And I thought this was really fascinating as well, because the immigration world that we find ourselves in today is so very different in its labyrinthian complexity than the immigration system that my grandparents and great-grandparents came to this country with. And I want to talk a little bit today about who exactly is coming to this country and what the process is like for them. So I graduated law school in 2012 and started working as a lawyer that same year. And in 2013, about 15,000 family members came to the southern border. And then the next year, almost 70,000 came. And from 14,000 to 68,000 is a huge jump, if you'll see on the far left. And we're like, wow, something really special is going on here. This is a huge increase in immigrants arriving. But then you look at fiscal year 2019 here on the graph, and you see that close to 500,000 members of family units arrived. And last year, more than 500,000. And when you see how much the numbers have skyrocketed from 2013 to 2022, you think, wow, what's going on? That's the first thing I notice. The second thing I notice on the far right there is that big blue other graph. So countries like Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, looks like Guatemala got cut off, I'm sorry. But those are the primary countries there that I would expect to see, and I think many people would expect to see. But you'll see that kind of teal other has really grown. So last year, for the first time ever, more people came to the US border from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela than our closer neighbors, Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And some of this you might have seen in the news. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just wanted to note that there's really unprecedented disasters happening all over the world at this time, and they're not only pandemic related. You'll see these quotes from the New York Times covering all kinds of things that are happening, including the biggest migration crisis in the Western Hemisphere due to what's happening in Venezuela now. And all of these form the background of our migration situation, but they're not the only contributors. In addition to poverty and political instability in Central America, farther afield, we have the war in Ukraine. And of course, all of you are aware of this, but I think some of the numbers to me are surprising. About 6 million people fled Ukraine. That's a tremendous number, and a deeply meaningful one to think about. And 25,000 undocumented Ukrainians came to the Mexican border. And I think this is interesting because people don't usually think of Ukrainians coming to the southern border. They'll think of Mexicans or Hondurans. But if folks can't get here by plane, they will get here any way they can when their life is in danger. And I think it's really interesting to see that that's true of someone from Honduras and equally true for someone from Ukraine. And so the U.S. response you'll see here was pretty good. You know, almost 200,000 Ukrainians got some sort of permission or way to stay. But I think what some observers mentioned was that there was a little bit of a welcome mat put down for this population. And people wondered when there are wars in South Sudan or what's going on in Syria, why the U.S. doesn't roll out the red carpet in the same way. And there were questions about why European folks might get different treatment. I can't say one way or the other, but that's been part of the reaction into how the US has chosen to handle the war in Ukraine, which is undoubtedly serious. And so when we think of refugees like those coming from Ukraine, we want to look a little bit at how the trends have changed over time. And not all my slides, I think, are so technical, but I did just want to put some numbers up in the beginning to give people something to think about. So the number to pay attention to, in my opinion, is the orange line. The orange is the actual number of refugees coming to our country, the United States. And you'll see in 1980, that was more than 200,000. You'll see there was another kind of spike around the 90s with the with the USSR, and many of you may have been involved in resettling Jews who are coming from the former Soviet Union during that time. And you'll see that the US took in so many refugees. And in fact, I don't think I can skip over the fact that the Refugee Convention actually came about, as many of you may know, as a byproduct of World War II. And the situation of Jewish refugees was instrumental into creating the refugee system that the US still adopts to this day. The refugee system that was governed after World War II, the definition has not changed. It's still the one we're using to evaluate refugees from Ukraine or from Honduras or Syria, anywhere else in the world. But you'll see this orange line. The blue line is just the number of refugees that the president by law has said we're allowed to admit. But the orange is the number of refugees that are actually arriving. And you'll see there's an unmistakable downward trend. And I think that's something to note as well, that when we once kind of took in more refugees than any country in the world, now at this moment, when there are more global crises than ever, we are taking in fewer refugees than we ever have in the entire history of our refugee program. And I think that's sort of an imbalance that I want to just put out there for a policy consideration. So when we look at the reasons why some of the folks are leaving, particularly in Central America, I don't want to understate the issue of regional violence as being really important. So, you know, not to scare anyone, but to talk about an actual reality, Central America has a deep problem with gang violence. And you'll see the homicide rate here per 100,000 people. And in El Salvador, you know, these statistics are a little bit old, you know, within, you know, maybe 7 or so years ago, but I think that generally, I still think that they're appropriate to look at. You'll see, you know, 108 homicides for every 100,000 people compared to the US, which is at 4.5. And I show this just to talk about, just to get a sense of the scale about how incredibly unstable it is for folks in these countries, and particularly young people who are most often targets of gang violence and recruiting. Here's a picture of some kids and a Honduran military official patrolling a neighborhood that, according to the article, gang members have taken over, and because of the ways that gangs have marked their territories, where the kids live and where their school is, and I saw this a lot, as an immigration lawyer, we're in two different territories. So the kids couldn't cross, and so they couldn't go to school because it would mean going from one gang's territory to another gang's territory. The effects that that has on a country, on a child's development, I can't even begin to contemplate and fathom. But in addition to that violence that we saw and the political instability, there's really abject poverty, social exclusion, a tremendous amount of gender-based violence and violence against women, and various forms of trafficking. And all of these factors are sort of pushing people to leave the homes that they know and compelling them to seek safety elsewhere. And my partner, my co-founder of Terra, Firma, and I'm going to tell you about that program later in the presentation, he says really emphatically, and I think this is a surprisingly profound statement, which he's like, the people we see do not want to migrate, and if they could stay, they would. And I think some people have the idea that what's driving migration is economic opportunity, and I don't think there's much doubt that the opportunities in this country are much greater than in some other places. But I also want to emphasize that's what's really pushing migration at the levels and to the extent that we're seeing now is not just hopes for a better job or a college education, but it's actually the unviability of continuing to live in a country that doesn't allow your children to grow. And so I'm going to talk about that and what that looks like. Finally, one of the last factors driving this huge uptick in migration that we've seen is the idea of those things that I just mentioned, the education and the opportunities, but also family reunification. So for instance, a child may have grown up in their home country in Honduras, and their mother may have come 10 years before to the United States to work and send money home to support her children, to support her family. Because of the restrictions for women to work over there, or because of the dangers or the lack of jobs or the corruption, any number of reasons. And so some children are coming to the United States to reunite with caretakers that they may not have seen in decades. And so these are just some of the big picture forces that are responsible for the trends in immigration and the degree to which we're seeing this as an important topic in the news. So up until now, I've kind of talked about immigrants as a general group and maybe talked a little bit about migrating families, but I want to focus now on a special population, a population that our laws, our Congress calls unaccompanied alien children. And unaccompanied children, as I call them without the word alien, are those that are under the age of 18 without legal immigration status and who come to our border without a parent or guardian available to provide for their care and physical custody at the time of apprehension. So what does that mean? Basically, we're talking about a kid like one I mentioned a few seconds ago who is no longer able to go to school because where he lives is in one gang's territory and his school is in a rival gang's territory. His parents say there's no future for you here. And so supporting him in all the best ways they can, they inspire and encourage and maybe support his journey to leave his home country and come to the United States. Maybe he leaves without telling them or without them knowing. It really depends. But what happens is that he will arrive at the US border with Mexico seeking protection here by himself, by him or herself. And when the government encounters young people under 18 at the border, there's a couple of questions that first come up, but one of the first is, do you know anyone here in the United States? And quite often the answer is yes. They may even have a family member who came to the United States years before. But the important thing is when they come to this country, they are legally and literally alone. And so the next couple slides that I'm about to show you have to do with their process migrating the system as children alone in our federal detention facilities. You'll see that the number of these kids, the number of kids who come here alone has also skyrocketed. You'll see the number in 2012, when I started working, 24,000, is actually fewer than the number of Ukrainians that came to the Mexican border in 2022. There were more Ukrainians than unaccompanied children, more Ukrainians this year than unaccompanied children from every country in the world combined in 2012. But of course, when 2014 happened and that number also went up to nearly 70,000, we thought, wow, what a tremendous rise this is. But then when you look at 2021 and 2022, the numbers have just once again skyrocketed to levels that we've never seen before. And it's put a strain on every single system that involves children in our country, including and especially the immigration system. And so what does this mean for New York State? I've been talking a lot about the border, but here in New York State, New York is the 4th highest receiving state of unaccompanied children, so behind Texas, California, and Florida. And last year, 8,543 children came to New York State by themselves, alone in the way that I described before. And between 2015 and 2022, that number was nearly 40,000 children who've come here by themselves, of all ages, from the very, very young to 17. Children of all ages, 0 to 18, really. Because you may have a child who, you may have a young mother, or you may have a 17-year-old bringing their baby sister who could be 6 or 9, and 2 children coming together. They're both going to be unaccompanied and put into this same system. So what does that system look like, and how do they get to New York State? Well, the first thing that happens is children arrive at the southern border, as do family units, anyone arriving at the border, and they'll be apprehended by Customs and Border Patrol and processed. This is step 1. I think there's kind of what I consider a misconception that somehow there's still folks that are coming through the border and maybe not getting apprehended. Everyone I met talks about the experience of actually seeking out Border Patrol and wanting and needing to turn themselves in to engage the legal process, to start the asylum process, to find the safety, stability, and the legal status that they hoped for and that brought them to America in the first place so that they can fully engage in our society. I think in years past, I think it might have been the case that folks may have been wanting to live more in the shadows or slip under the radar. At this point, you'll see from images like this that it's really kind of a casual, mutual, or at least it can be, seeking out of Border Patrol by arriving immigrants to really start the process of coming to this country. But the next things that happen in that process aren't always pleasant. This is a detention kind of holding or facility. You'll see that I think in this photo, it's going to be all men. There are other facilities that house women and children. But these facilities are often cold. There's often limited access to food, water, and medical care, and they're only designed to hold people for 24 to 48 hours. They're not fun places to be. They're often not up to adequate standards because they're not subject to the same regulations that a homeless shelter might be or that a foster care home might be because they're federal in nature and they don't often have to follow the same rules that other state institutions do. So they're overcrowded, showers, bathrooms, access to all those really important things, food, they are extremely limited, but fortunately by law, folks are only supposed to be held there for a day or 2. So step 3, after they get out of those kind of detention centers at the border, is that children are sent to what are called Office of Refugee Resettlement Shelters, ORR shelters, around the country. At any given moment, latest statistics show that there are almost 7,000 children in these facilities across the country. There's 200 of them in about 22 states, and kids stay there for about 30 days on average. My work as an immigration lawyer, and I haven't talked so much about my own work, but kind of giving the background of immigration writ large here. I'll get into my work in a moment, but one thing I do want to say about it now is that, I've been to these shelters and I've worked with kids who are held there. And I want to give you a sense of it being kind of a cross between a foster care home and a young person's prison. It's a foster care home in the sense that children are provided a safe place to stay. Many have undergone harrowing journeys, riding on the tops of train cars or or being held at ransom by gangs, even after they leave and try to make the journey here. Many going without food or water or adequate nutrition, obviously. And so these shelters really are, in some ways, do play a respite role for kids to kind of normalize again. At the same time, all the doors are locked. They're not allowed to leave. They're not allowed to go to the bathroom by themselves. It's kind of a bunks or barrack system where they sleep. So it is very much a detention center in how it's designed, even though in some ways it is supposed to be, and it is in fact, a more welcoming place for children. And so the last step of what brings them from their home country, maybe leaving it because of danger, arriving at the border, going into one of those refugee shelters I just mentioned, the last step is reunification. So this map on the left here has the bigger yellow circles indicating the most common places that unaccompanied children go. You'll see that, you know, New York City, Long Island has some big yellow circles there. LA, Texas, Florida has some big yellow circles. But basically what happens is a child will be in one of these refugee shelters, and the government workers there will ask, who do you know in the United States? And the child will often have a phone number or a name or an address, and the government worker will then try to contact that person, do a background check or a little vetting, and see if it's safe to release the child to that person. And those people are called sponsors. You'll see here on the right that almost 50% of the time, the child is actually reuniting with a parent. So maybe their parent came here years earlier, and they're reuniting with their parent for the first time in a long time, which can be very beautiful. It can also be very fraught. I think, as you can imagine, even parents who had the best intentions of providing and caring for their children may not be expecting the level of emotional nuance that comes when they meet a teenager whose lives they haven't been in personally in over a decade, and getting to rebuild those relationships, understanding what the parent-child dynamic is there. A parent even just wanting to do basic discipline, impose rules on a child that they haven't seen in a long time can be very complicated. So while these reunions are often really beautiful, they're often just the start of a child's journey to understand their place in this country. So that happens about half the time, and about a quarter of the time it's another relative. And it could be an aunt, an uncle, or a cousin, or someone the child has never even met before. Maybe circumstances in their country were so dire that they left, and they're reuniting with someone whom they have never met, and they will have to learn how to live with. 15% of the time, that person is a sibling. 1% of the time, it's a grandparent. And 14% of the time, they may go into group homes or group foster care systems if there is no viable relative that they can be reunited with. So I just wanted to give kind of the 4 steps of how they go from the border when they first arrive at the US-Mexico border to actually coming to a place like New York City. So I'll stop and take a breath here and just point out that we're talking about legal processes and systems and numbers and graphs, but I also want to talk about experientially what it may be like from a child who goes from the rural highlands of Guatemala to being released into New York City or downtown Manhattan. I was telling some friends the other night that, I've met kids who seem like they'd never been in an elevator before or never seen a computer before. And now they're in the New York City school system and being given an iPad. And it's just, I say that because it's really the tip of the iceberg about what kids have to adjust to and how they have to kind of make new lives here in the United States, and just how really challenging that is. And I want to talk about 2 ways that it's challenging in particular and specifically. The first way that it's challenging has to do with healthcare. Healthcare is a huge issue in this country, even for US citizens, but it's especially hard for new immigrants. And I want to just explain this map very briefly. So the dark green you'll see on the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, California, then Illinois, New York, Massachusetts, and DC. The dark green are the states that have chosen to use funds that they have at their discretion to make health insurance available for undocumented children. So if you're under 18, you're an unaccompanied child who's come to this country, you can get health insurance if you live in one of those 5 states. Until recently, those were the only places. This year, we've seen some great trends in terms of Connecticut, Maine, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Vermont. You'll see there on the right, having passed similar types of legislation, allowing immigrant children to have health insurance, in some cases, even going so far as to allow pregnant immigrant women to have health insurance. But I want to focus on kids in particular, because one thing that every child has a right to in this country, whether they're an immigrant, undocumented, or what have you, is to be in school. The Supreme Court says that every child has a right to a free public education. And so from a policy perspective, I question, and I'd love to hear other thoughts from the group, about whether it makes sense to have two children sitting next to each other in a classroom with different levels of access to primary care, to vaccinations, especially in these pandemic COVID times. I ask, why wouldn't you want all children to be healthy? And so the states that have really limited children's ability to access a doctor, I think is a mistake, is my personal opinion. And so besides healthcare, the other main issue, and the second issue that I want to focus on today, is legal. Unaccompanied children have no right to government-appointed counsel. I often talk about, maybe not when I was 3, when Amy knew me, but at least in high school, I would be watching Law and Order. And something you hear on TV all the time, I'm sure everyone here has heard it, is you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, the court will appoint one for you. And that is an American ideal, but it is not true of immigrants. If you are an immigrant child, if you are an adult with intellectual disabilities or physical handicaps, you have no right to a government-appointed attorney, no matter who you are. And so as a result, nearly half of all immigrants with pending cases have no lawyers, no one to defend their rights in immigration court. And, I think when most people think about this, it doesn't comport with their ideas of justice. I think about a child in court alone against a government prosecutor with a proceeding being conducted in English, with a translator whispering in a child's ear that under Section 208 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, they have the legal burden to provide that they're a refugee under the convention. And if they're able to make that showing, they can stay in this country. That doesn't sound like a level playing field. And I think if more people knew that, it would shock their sense of what justice can really look like in America. And I'm getting to kind of the latter half of my presentation here. And I just want to underscore this point that the legal representation that doesn't exist for immigrants actually matters. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a lawyer. You'll see here that for folks who don't have a lawyer, those are the 2 bars on the right, they will be denied immigration protection 85% of the time if they do not have a lawyer. You'll see for the 2 bars on the left, represented folks, if they do have a lawyer, they have an almost 50% chance of winning some form of legal status in the United States. And so you can see that many people get deported not because they don't have meritorious claims, but because they don't have people to articulate those claims, to represent them, to advocate for them in a legal way. And so our court system every day is having cases get denied because the people that are being ordered deported did not come to this country as trained attorneys. And I personally don't think that that should be the standard. And so what is the solution to some of these problems, particularly the 2 I just mentioned, healthcare and legal representation? Well, I can't say what the solution is in an ultimate sense, but one thing that we're working on is a program that we founded called Terra Firma. And our motto is healthcare and justice for immigrant children. And the way that Terra Firma works is by combining medical and legal services to help immigrant children the best way we know how. And one way is for doctors to document what has happened in the life of a child. For instance, we had one child that we served, and he was being threatened by gangs in his home country. The gang said, please join our gangs, commit crimes with us. He said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to go to school. And they said, oh, you want to go to school? We'll show you. And they took a car and they ran over his legs and they broke both of his legs. And so when he came to the United States, he told us that story and we said, wow, that's incredible. How can we show this story to the judge? And one way that we could do that was having a doctor perform a physical examination and examine the bones and the plates and the joints and whatever surgeries he had in his own country. I couldn't begin to tell you. And have a doctor write an affidavit describing what he saw and the fact that what he saw from a medical perspective is consistent with what the client is saying from a legal perspective. And so in this way, the doctor can really be an advocate for an immigrant simply by sharing what he sees in the exam room. And we've found, and not just we, but those who have tried this model, have found that doctors supporting immigrants can make a huge difference in the case. If a doctor writes an affidavit in an immigration case, that case wins about 82% of the time. The national rate of success is about half that. So you see, a doctor can double someone's chances of winning their immigration case just by performing an exam and telling the judge what they've seen in that exam room. And so what the Terra Firma model does is try to do more by bringing all services under one roof, have medical, legal, and mental health services in one place. These are some of my clients, actually, that you'll see in the photos below. And they've come to our community health center in the South Bronx to not only get medical services, not only get legal services, but start therapy services and start to do a trauma-informed support group, doing youth enrichment classes. The photo on the left here is actually a photography class where kids were given a camera and told to go out into their communities and take photos of things that were meaningful or expressed them, represented them. On the right is some kids with a soccer ball from our community soccer league. And so the idea is that if we're able to co-locate services, there are real benefits, not just in terms of kids winning their cases, but in terms of really acclimating and adjusting and thriving here in the United States. And one of the ways that looks like is, I might be meeting with a child back in the pre-pandemic days in person, and I'll say, tell me about your story. And they'll tell me about their story, and it'll be a quite difficult and traumatic one. And I'll say, thank you for sharing that with me. Now we're going to walk down the hall and I'm going to introduce you to a therapist, and you can start to talk to them about how that made you feel. And by combining services in this way, we really are able to do a lot more than we'd be able to do on our own. So it's essentially about breaking down silos. This is a picture of my co-founder, Dr. Alan Shapiro, with one of the patients, one of my clients. And when he's meeting with a child in an exam room, he's doing a couple of things. One is that he's developing a patient relationship in which a child or a young person, this guy looks like he's about 16 or 17 in this photo, that may actually help with the legal case. So for example, if someone is doing a reproductive or sexual health screening in a medical exam, it might come out that the person is gay. And if someone's gay, they may have a fear of being harmed based on their sexual orientation in their home country. And with the young person's consent, that can be communicated to their lawyer, presented to the judge, and depending on what country they're from and the rules and regulations about homosexuality there, that can change a young person's life. And so in some ways, the whole team works together to support the child by understanding them holistically. The other thing it does is improve a child's ability to testify in court. So you see a young person who, what happens in their future is going to depend greatly on being able to talk about the thing they don't want to talk about. The bad thing that happened in their home country is what's going to help them win their asylum case. And so really having that conversation with multiple people, being able to articulate it, and with the help of professionals like doctors and therapists finding their voice, they're able to then, on game day, so to speak, in the courtroom, really own their story and be more authoritative. I think one thing it can do is in some situations, it can obviate the need to tell their story. I remember one client who had been had been sexually assaulted, and he had shared that with his therapist. And the therapist documented that, and we submitted that affidavit to the court. And when we walked into court that day, the adjudicator said, I've read the affidavit, and I'm not going to make the child testify. And because of that, they did not have to relive their trauma in a high-stakes legal courtroom environment. And it was because the therapist lent their voice to the discussion, and mental health and medicine got involved in the conversation that was happening in a legal setting. And not only did the child win that case, they were able to do it with a greater sense of dignity. And so just kind of briefly, here's a sense of some of the issues and the challenges that kids face and how Terra Firma tries to address them. You know, I mentioned family unification, the financial stress of now someone, let's say it's an aunt, and they've never met this child before, but their sister said, hey, my son is coming up to the United States. Can you take him in? That person may be undocumented themselves. That person may be trying to make ends meet. So it's not just a stress on the child or the person that's migrated, but on the family, the new family that they're joining here in the United States. And so we'll do group therapy, but also family therapy. Then there's language and acculturation. So we have English classes, we have soccer programs, we have photography, and we have a youth support group so that even children who came to this country alone are not alone when they get here. And that's because they'll have a group of folks who have like experiences that they can talk about their journeys with and what that meant for them, and find that solidarity and build that sense of community that we all know is possible. And I'll kind of wrap up here, and I'll be really excited to hear any comments or questions that you have with kind of the next stage of our program. So for the last 10 years, we've been operating Terra Firma in the way I just described, out of a community health center in the South Bronx. And last year, essentially, we decided to take the extra step and create a new nonprofit that spun off to take the program we've been doing here in New York and start it in other places. And so what we want to do is have a national network of programs that combine medical, legal, and mental health services for immigrants. We believe we've found a really good way for those different disciplines and different fields to talk to each other, to work together, and to collaborate to enhance the opportunities, to encourage the resilience, and to start treating the trauma and beginning the conversation about really what coming to America can mean for the hundreds of thousands of children and families who are now doing it. And we think the time is right to improve the way that quality services are delivered to these folks. And the underlying belief or kind of creed that we have is that we believe that all children and families deserve health care and justice. All children and families deserve health care and justice with no caveats. And so something like primary care or having a lawyer to stand next to you if you have to go to court are part of those essential rights. So, you know, this is a little bit more in the weeds, but, you know, 4 things we're trying to do with the new nonprofit is to support the original program that we've been doing for the last 10 years, keep it going, developing this national network, seeding programs across the country, whether that's in upstate New York or down south in Florida, and then building a center of advocacy to help improve policies, immigration policy that basically uses medical and mental health and research based on what we know, and then start to conduct new research. What are the needs of unaccompanied children? How do we start to deal with the large number of people that are coming here? And what's the most effective way to have a humanitarian response to the various humanitarian disasters that are causing people to flee in the first place? So that's basically the end of my presentation here. If you want to learn more, that's our website up there, terrafirma.nyc. I want to thank you guys for having me, for hearing me out. And I just want to say that, you know, I'm not here just on myself or the organization, but I also always feel like when I'm telling kids stories, I'm speaking on behalf of them too. And I think that the welcoming communities from like synagogues and shuls all over the country that have played such an important role in stepping up to the challenge in different ways when immigrants have arrived, both now and historically, is something that I know that everyone who's looking for refuge and safety not only appreciates, but finds as a necessity in terms of starting a new life here in the United States. So thank you so much for having me, and happy to talk about anything that might come up.
So I can't imagine that you all don't agree with me that that was a really informative and moving and well presented picture of the situation. And I open up the forum for any questions for Brett. Head Rabbi.
Hi, just wanted to say thank you again for coming and sharing your work with us. And you might not know, but we this year have chosen to focus on 2 issues of social justice in our as our adult education and social action themes of the year, which is immigration and our own. Yeah, I loved that you started your presentation by talking about your own history of being a child of or grandchild of immigrants, and how that sort of structures your thinking around this issue. And that's exactly what we were hoping to do with that theme. The other theme is the environment, which is less connected to your particular work. But that goes to my question, which is, how was your grandfather, great-grandfather, whatever, how was his experience different arriving as an unaccompanied minor to Ellis Island in the late 19th century or the early 20th century? How is it different from what you just described as the current reality of the kids that you work with in your program? Or what are the main differences, do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to go ask my mom that question right as soon as I get off that call. I mean, by the way, I did want to say something, the issues of climate change or the environment, I think you said, and immigration aren't totally disconnected. Like I actually had a slide here that I took out about flooding in Pakistan in 2022. I think something like 33 million people were displaced. And so that causes mass migration, which then has a ripple effect. And, folks are moving for reasons related to their environments changing. And so, of course, the earth is changing. The people that live on earth also have to respond to that change. So I don't think they don't have to be totally separate issues. But I think one of the main differences is how much more sophisticated the immigration system has got and how much more backlogged it's got. I think, back in the old days, there really wasn't the same level of rules and regulations for what you needed to do to come and live here legally. I think, one of the strange features of our system is that many of the immigration rules are processed by country, right? So if you want to immigrate and you have all the proper paperwork to get a green card and you do everything exactly right, and you come from, the country of Georgia, let's say, maybe, and it's kind of a hypothetical, you could be done with your paperwork in a year. But if you come from the country of India, you're going to be waiting 10, 20, maybe 30 years until you have an opportunity to really get an interview for that green card for which you are legally eligible for today. And that's because so many people are immigrating from India that the line from that country is that much longer. And that's just a very bizarre kind of way that our immigration system works. And my grandparents never had to deal with anything like that.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Mary Gross. I was just wondering, in addition to donations, how do you support the organization? Do you have federal grants or state funding?
Yeah, so there's two kind of organizations at this point. One is the Direct Services Organization that we've been doing for the last 10 years. That one's in the South Bronx. That one has a mix of funding from the New York Council, so New York City, as well as private grants. And it is a federally qualified health center as well. But there's the program that's spun off Terra, Firma National, where we're trying to replicate the program, get it out to more places, start new sites. And that's where I'm working now. That's where I'm based, using the lessons learned from the first 10 years. And that program has all individual donors and private foundations. So like the Robin Hood Foundation is a major philanthropic organization in New York whose mission is to alleviate poverty by funding programs that they hope and they see, and that not just hope and see, they're a very data-driven organization that they believe the data demonstrates and indicates will be successful in combating poverty, in participating in anti-poverty measures. And so they've been a big supporter and funder of ours as well. So Terra Firma National, where I work, no, does not have any federal or state funding.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up question. I was just wondering, in terms of staffing, how many physicians and therapists and do you have?
Yeah. So at the direct service program, the Terra Firma flagship program that we call it in the South Bronx, I'm not the medical director, so I'm not the best person to ask, but I would say there's probably maybe like 6 doctors that are participating in the project, maybe 3 mental health clinicians, and taking referrals from dozens of lawyers from all over the city. So lawyers from the Legal Aid Society or the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, whatever, will make referrals to this health center, and the lawyers and doctors and the nursing team there will try to keep up with the demand. And then we also have kids and patients coming off the street. You know, I was saying the other day, I'll be representing someone as my client, and then one day they'll bring in their cousin and they'll say, you know, like, oh, my cousin just arrived. Can you be their lawyer too? And I think that's kind of special because it's kind of helping a whole family find stability, and it kind of lifts up everyone in a given community. And I like that aspect of it. I think another thing that I kind of miss from pre-pandemic days, even though there's a lot of great things about being remote, I think in person, you could just connect with people so much more easily and so much more casually. You know, like this only happened once, so I don't want to make too big a thing out of it. But there was one time I had a young woman, a teenager, and I was trying to give her a green card. And I think her phone got disconnected, or she'd moved, or I had no way of contacting her. And, you know, a lot of folks have very unstable housing situations, or they're living paycheck to paycheck. They can't afford to pay the cell phone bill every month, or they have to change their number. I couldn't get in touch with this person. And as I was leaving the community clinic, I ran into them on the subway platform right outside. And I just handed them their green card while we were waiting for the train. And that's like, that was a really cool moment for me, because it just kind of showed the value of being in place in a space where people live, as opposed to other models where clients have to travel to you. You know, my offices otherwise were in Wall Street in the financial district, and not a lot of immigrants live there. So to go back to your question, even though it's like a small team of doctors and nurses, there's also a lot of people that pass through it. So that may not be their full-time thing, but like medical residents or people on, you know, medical fellowships can do some of their training through this program, student interns, law students. So like the number of people helping out, you know, different professionals in different capacities is much larger than the number of people working there full-time. But even the number of full-time includes like administrators and folks helping us run the program.
Thank you.
So I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry, Mishka, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask some about the staffing and how many are professionals, how many are volunteers, and so on. Among the crazinesses going on these days is the governors of Florida and Texas putting people on buses or planes and bringing them up north. How are you handling these things, or how are you involved with these things? And then they just another piece of that brings to mind another piece, which is what kind of lobbying are you guys doing as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were part of Terra Firma was part of the New York City response to the bust families. And so when Mayor Adams declared a state of emergency, Terra Firma was involved in conversations with the mayor's office to provide healthcare to the people who had recently come. And a lot of the folks that had come, because it was so overwhelming and so unexpected and unplanned by design, you know, planned to be unplanned in order to disrupt and create chaos, a lot of folks ended up going into the New York homeless shelter system, not because that's where they best belong, but because that's what the circumstances dictated. And so the program that we work with, that Terra Firma is based out of, actually already runs a homeless healthcare system for Native New Yorkers in general. And so they're particularly and especially well equipped and were and are to handle that kind of crisis. So for instance, you know, way before busing or, you know, the latest big numbers of immigrants, they had a mobile medical unit that would basically, it's a big blue bus that they drive to different hotspots or homeless shelters in the city to deliver healthcare on site to homeless populations. And so what I feel I was really lucky in partnering with them for is that they already have services and programs that they can just utilize, leverage, redeploy, redirect to these new populations. So we're absolutely involved in the response to the bus families and will continue to be. As to your question about policy and advocacy, that is definitely an area that we want to grow and improve on in 2023. You know, we were only technically incorporated, Terra Firma National, in 2021. And, you know, just are getting our taxes and paperwork, you know, in 2022. But now that we kind of are fully formed and ready to go, that's an area that we want to grow in. And I think, you know, I actually attended a legislative briefing with Senator Chuck Schumer recently. And it was amazing just to hear him and other folks there that day talk about immigration as a challenge for New Yorkers, but without a lot of real ideas about what some of the solutions were going to be. And we definitely want to be part of that conversation, not only because we think that policies promoting immigrant health are important, but also because we think the voices of medicine and mental health are often missing from those conversations. And, you know, we think that we have the ability to help amplify those voices. So it's not just a question of legal status and, you know, court proceedings, but really we understand it from like a more humanitarian perspective where we say, these people are people. How do we start to approach the issues of what their basic needs are?
Good. So a growing new organization. Kathy, you have a question? You've got to unmute.
Actually, it's not a question. I just, on the local level, I think coming out of this talk, I think it's important for people to think of how we can support that specific organization, because it's really seems like it's spearheading a really different kind of focus on how to support immigrants as they come in, and immigrant children, obviously, in particular. Just to point out that in Albany, the organizations that are available are one called RISE, R-I-S-S-E, which we've had some connections to. They came and talked at our Passover service one day last year. That's Refugee and Immigrant Support Services, IMAUS. So they're located in Albany, and they do a lot of different kinds of things. And SICM here, Schenectady Inner City Ministry, which we have people who are on the board for, and we have volunteer programs where we go and help out. That a lot of SICM does, particularly food-related issues, but a lot of other things as well. And then the literacy volunteers of Rensselaer County handle tutoring for the whole Capital District. And where it used to be Native English learners, primarily who had support from literacy volunteers, 2/3 of their of the people that they service currently are people who are immigrants as well, and working on their English and math and other skills. And so Literacy Volunteers supports that, and we have someone coming to talk in a couple of weeks. So there's New York City is certainly a heavy concentration and a lot of resources, and we have some of those things here that we can plug into directly, as well as to support Terra Firma and its various projects.
Thank you. And just along those lines, Brett, I mean, obviously money, but when you were telling us about the children who are kind of in the detention centers or halfway houses or whatever, foster care, are there things that we could do, like in terms of clothing or books or other kinds of things that you need that would be helpful? And then also I wanted to know, are there children who end up not having a sponsor, and what happens to children?
Yeah. So on the first question, I have to check with our volunteer coordinator. I'm not sure I know all the rules, but absolutely there is a need for coats, backpacks, winter clothing. You know, kids are coming from places that don't have winters like they have in Schenectady. So they don't have a lot of those clothes, and you know, money is tight. And so there is a need for those kinds of donations, not so much in the shelters, but in the community, kind of maybe in some of the ways Kathy was just talking about, like those organizations that might be directly working with them. But Terra Firma as well, you know, taking clothes. We have a backpack drive. We have a winter coat drive. We buy hats, scarves, and gloves. We have a food pantry to give to folks. And so, yes, all of those are needed, and all of those are important. And your question about kids who don't have sponsors, I mean, they may go into like kind of, there's a couple of different ways that they can go. There's something called the federal foster care system, where if they qualify for certain immigration benefits, they may be able to access. But then there's also like state foster care systems, and like, you know, homeless shelters for youth of all immigration statuses. And so a small percentage of kids end up in those kinds of shelters as well.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions before we wrap it up for tonight? All right, well, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to learn with us tonight about this really important issue. And I want to thank you, Brett, for really an excellent presentation. Definitely gave us all things to think about tonight. And I wish everybody a happy good night.
Thank you so much. It was great to meet all of you. Thank you for having me. Best of luck in your work.
Thank you.